Hey guys, I wanted to do a quick word on research concepts with you. I'm going to try to start making these videos a little bit shorter because I keep hitting my bandwidth limit on Vimeo, and that makes my life way more complicated than it has to be. In research, when we start gathering information to kind of put some, like sources in these genres, it's important to understand a few basic concepts. I give this lecture to my courses all the time, and it actually is pretty illuminating. In academia, we have two different types of sources, and we'll get into, two different types. We have primary sources. Primary sources are when you have a source of information, somebody who has actual first-hand experience with whatever it is you're discussing. A victim of a crime, someone who lives in a community that knows of a particular issue. Secondary sources are when somebody has no personal connection to what you're talking about. Somebody who sat down in an office somewhere and wrote a paper, did their research, and tried to be more objective about it. Journalistic writing and stuff like that. In academia, we have massively favored the secondary source over the primary. And it's because there was an idea that secondary sources were supposed to be more objective than primary sources, and there is some truth to that. We're starting to kind of, give a little bit more attention to the primary source, but one of the things I tell students is, if a secondary source is supposed to be an attempt at objectivity, a primary source is an attempt to be interesting. It's an attempt to flavor your writing and give it like emotional impact. When you talk to somebody who's had first-hand experience, you're dealing with a completely different type of research. And the point I always use to make for this is September 11th. What was a primary source for September 11th? Most people still say firefighters, police officers, people who were there, people who were at the scene. 9/11 did something really interesting. 9/11 turned almost all of us into primary sources. I'm just now starting to get students in my classes that don't remember September 11th because they weren't in kindergarten when it happened. So that's a very strange thing when you start to think about it. I remember where I was. I remember what I was doing. I was in high school, and I remember walking into the room. We had been in post-secondary option at that time, and we'd been sequestered from the rest of the school. And when I walked into my French class, there was the image on the TV screen. I'm never going to forget walking into that room and seeing the towers on fire. And 9/11 did something very strange in that everybody who remembers it became a primary source, in that we were watching that event take place, watching it on live TV, witnessing people die. I mean, as those towers collapsed, everybody has an emotional story that they can tell. And so it's actually really hard to find a secondary source on 9/11. What is a secondary source? Most journalists are going to have some type of emotional skin in the game when you start talking about 9/11. They make a big attempt to be objective. They try to distance themselves from it. But it does blur the lines a little bit. So when we talk about primary and secondary sources, I mean, there is a little bit of arguability to that. Now, for your genres, I'm going to ask you to use more secondary sources than primary, and you don't have to use sources in all of them. My basic requirement is I want at least 4 total sources, and I'm thinking like 2 primary, 2 secondary. You can evenly split it, but if you're going to go more on one side, try to lean more to the secondary. But the primary sources are actually, they can be really interesting. They can add a lot of flavor to your writing when you talk to somebody who has a first-hand experience with the account. That's the reason why we don't trust autobiographies very much. People have a tendency to aggrandize their accomplishments and gloss over things that might not be so positive. Biographies are considered more authoritative. Isn't that weird? So start to think about what are some primary and secondary sources for your genres. And we're going to do a forum discussion question with that later. Again, let's experiment with the shorter videos. Y'all have an excellent day.